The lectionary text for this morning is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 21 through 37. And I will be reading from the Common English Bible if you'd like to follow along with me. This is what he says in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel. You have heard it was said, don't commit adultery. But I say to you that every man who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. And if your right eye causes you to fall into sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better that you lose a part of your body than your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to fall into sin, chop it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose a part of your body than your whole body go into hell. It was said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a divorce certificate. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual unfaithfulness, forces her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard it said to those who lived long ago, don't make a false solemn pledge. But you should follow through on what you have pledged to the Lord. But I say to you, you must not pledge at all. You must not pledge by heaven because it's God's throne. You must not pledge by earth because it's God's footstool. You must not pledge by Jerusalem because it's the city of the great king. And you must not pledge by your head because you can't turn one hair white or black. Let your yes mean yes, and your no mean no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. The gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God. Adultery, divorce, and solemn pledges. That's what Jesus is talking about in this passage that is carefully cultivated for us to share this morning. Adultery, divorce, and solemn pledges. This gospel lesson pops up in the Revised Common Lectionary just in time for Valentine's Day. You know the story. They met at a party on New Year's Eve, exchanging smoldering looks over the top of the champagne flutes. What started as a New Year's kiss developed into a steamy romance. Throughout January, they dated, they hung out, they got to know each other, and they always had the other to rely on for companionship, comfort. That good feeling you get when someone, at least partially adores you for a certain amount of time. But they always had a +1 for every event. But that all ended the second week of February. Because of the pressure of Valentine's Day. That pressure descended upon them both, and so instead of dealing with the pressure, they just gave up and broke up. And that split, like the zygote of a new person, that split creates another story. They met at a Valentine's Day party. Having recently had a breakup, they were ready for another steamy romance. You know the story. It's an old story. And on and on and on. They will break up before the holidays, not to have the pressure. But today's February 12th, so if you're thinking about it, you might as well do it this afternoon. Give the person enough time to make other arrangements. But it makes you wonder, how many people are giving up on love because it's too much hassle, too much pressure? Well, is that really the reason, though? A couples counselor noted that people in relationships tend to be guarded against rejection. They're so guarded to the extent they never get to the threshold of emotional intimacy, which is kind of the tie that keeps you there. The person may look great on paper, check all the boxes, but there's got to be something unseen that keeps you coming back for more. And because of the guarded way we live our lives, that emotional intimacy is just steps away, but never quite gone through the door. But no one wants to get rejected for any reason. That's why people are more afraid of public speaking than of death. No one wants to get rejected. We put ourselves out there. It's scary, it's complicated, it's exhausting. And for us this morning, going to church, in today's Common Revised Lectionary, the texts from Matthew that will be widely read in the Roman Catholic, Episcopalian, Lutheran, Presbyterian churches, just in time for Valentine's Day. Adultery, divorce, and broken promises. Porneia is the Greek word that is used here. It's kind of the word that's kind of throwing a wrench in a lot of things going on, especially in the Methodist Church. It's the Greek word used by Matthew here in this passage. It occurs 25 times in 24 verses in the New Testament. The word appears for the first time in the New Testament here in Matthew 5, verse 32. In the passage it says, "But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for," translated roughly, "sexual unfaithfulness." But the word that Matthew uses there, the Greek word, is porneia. It's where we get, it's a root word for some other things. I don't have to say them. You're smart enough. You recognize it. Except for porneia, if a man divorces his wife, except for that, he forces her to commit adultery. Now, what is Jesus even talking about here? And this passage, don't get me wrong, this passage has been used to take it and create doctrine and keep you from sitting at the table of Jesus because you did this divorce and Jesus said you can't have a divorce. And it's used as a barrier and a stumbling block. Because you know what people are going to do. They're just going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. They're going to go to brunch on Sunday, and they're not going to be a Christian anymore. It's not a good idea to take a Sermon on the Mount with what is kind of pastoral care, and I'll explain that later, and make it into a doctrine so you can exclude certain people. One of the big misconceptions about the transgressions that Jesus is talking about here, adultery, divorce, and solemn pledges, is that if you participate in those things, you're not hurting anybody else, right? It's not like murder or theft or infractions around that area. All the aforementioned divorce and adultery and solemn pledges are completely legal and accepted in most of society. I mean, you could throw shame on them, but you can't be arrested for it. But they all have one thing in common, these things that Jesus mentions in this passage. Breaking your word. Going back on a promise that you made, damaging somehow a relationship. Adultery and divorce are what is a marriage but a promise between two people? And adultery, a breach of that promise, right? Divorce is often the result of adultery, so they kind of go hand in hand. But Jesus is speaking in a particular context. So in the beginning when he says if a man looks on a woman lustfully, he's committing adultery, and all the women in the room are like, oh, that stuff off the hook. No, he addresses it later because if you would divorce your wife because of any reason except adultery, because if she does that, then you get to divorce her. So it's even Stevens. But why does he point that out in that way? It's contextual, though. I'm going to tell you right now that it's contextual. Jesus is speaking to this particular context, and he's concerned that men divorce their wives for arbitrary reasons, and it leaves them destitute because of the patriarchal structures that require women to marry or have a father or a son take care of them, or a nephew. And that's why there's so much in the Bible about caring for orphans and widows, because, in the first century, there's no life insurance. There were no social security benefits. There was no legal recourse for a woman to defend her right to live in her home and maintain her lifestyle should she be arbitrarily divorced when, the wind blew the wrong way and her husband decided that's what he wanted. And that is what Jesus is talking about. He's condemning this idea that men who were dominant in that society in terms of economics were going through and just divorcing women willy-nilly and leaving them destitute. Divorce broke the social fabric back then for women. Nowadays, it's different. Jesus is less concerned about forcing people who have clearly fallen out of love, who cannot get along anymore. He's less concerned about having them stay married. He doesn't want all these women in the first century dismissed by their husbands just because they can with this certificate and no other question is asked, and the women end up homeless and hungry. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. She should have married someone else who would have gotten along with her better and saw her plight as a woman and cared enough to keep supporting her. Adultery, divorce, and solemn pledges. Jesus redefines the law in Matthew's gospel. It's not just committing the act for the followers of Jesus. He addresses the very thought in these you have heard it said, but I say to you. So they know the law, the people he's speaking to. You have heard it said. They know the law. They know what it is. He's taking it a step further. He's taking it a step further, and this was where I would have loved to preach this other sermon around this. The one that says, well, it's really not about divorce and adultery and breaking your word. It's more about how we treat one another, which it is. And I think I did preach a sermon about that. But what it kind of stuck with me, and it stuck in my craw, I guess, was that I would easily want to shy away from preaching on adultery, divorce, and solemn pledges, especially this time of year. But that's not something I don't want to go there. I don't want to be preaching about that. However, Jesus said those words. If you have a red letter edition and you read this passage, it's mostly red. So what do we do with them? What can we do? Well, Jesus says, rip out our eyes and chop off our hands. Jesus, of course, is using hyperbole, which was a common practice for first century rabbis to use a literary device such as hyperbole to influence their disciples, to make the point. And what he says about you have heard it said in the law, but I say to you, even the very thought, not even the act, the very thought puts you in sin peril. What he's saying, we can try, but who could live the blameless life with these rules? Really, he's setting the bar too high for any of us. Now, why would Jesus do that? Because then we need him. Don't we? We need his forgiveness. We need his love. Who can live a blameless life with rules like this? It reminds me of Paul's struggle with his people in Rome. In Romans 7, verses 15 through 20, he says, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But I hate what I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. Like there's a reason for it. As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it is sin living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do. This I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it's the sin living in me that does it. Well, that's kind of passing the buck, Paul. But in his letter to the Romans, Paul is struggling. This is like thousands of years ago, guys. Paul is struggling with what Jesus has rightly identified as a concern for our living. Whether it's potato chips or your neighbor's wife and everything in between, we are tempted. We are flesh and blood, and we give in. God is tolerant because we are perfect. No, we're not perfect. And Jesus wants to take it a step further and give us not just the rules and the law, but say, you know, if you even think of this, it's not good. But what's his point here? We already talked about the divorce situation. He doesn't want these women going around destitute and men abusing the power they have to divorce. Divorce was not given to them for that purpose. We know what it's like to be Paul. We know what to do. We just don't do it. And Jesus' heart is bent towards the breakup of the love relationships. Adultery, divorce, the solemn pledges. Ultimately, it's about people hurting other people. The sin that Jesus is concerned about is how we hurt others by our actions or our inactions, by withholding our love, by sitting outside the door at the threshold to emotional intimacy and too afraid of rejection to step through. I could only preach about this if I know it myself. I read somewhere that the music that you like to listen to is probably stuff that you listen to in your late teens, early 20s. And that is not true for me. I have adopted as my pleasurable music stuff that was popular when I was like 7. And I'm still trying to figure out why that is, or what it has to do. Well, a lot of the music in that era that I like, it's not necessarily the era, it's more the type of music. They're all like sappy love songs, like Air Supply, you know, and Hall & Oates, and anything that Whitney Houston was singing about. And I realized that I've developed this taste because I've been in love for a really long time now. I'm just lucky. I mean, call it what you will, you know, call it, oh, this is a blessing. It has nothing to do with anything I did or deserve or anything like that. And I think when we try to label those things, we just make it pejorative for others. We want to invite more people into the conversation. I think it's luck. But when I think about that, those love relationships, a lot of them are about breakups. A lot of them are about the hurt and the pain that goes into the love relationships and these beautiful songs. We're not perfect. And we don't treat each other like perfect people should. And realistically, nobody can be perfect, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And that is Jesus' other point here. And it's kind of a John Wesley theme as well. We're not perfect. Nobody can be. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Try for the good. Like Paul. Try to do the good we don't do. Try to make the world a better place. God, through Jesus Christ, wants us to try holding a precious place in our hearts for people around us. To love and be loved. Tuesday is Valentine's Day. It's time to show your love. Are you ready to show your love? All right, anyone? You can show your love. You can start today. You can stay after church and make the sandwiches for hungry people. And it may seem simple, but it's an expression of love. That you care enough to spend your time, which is precious and limited and finite. We even had a prayer request about that. You don't know what tomorrow brings. We're not promised tomorrow. We're promised the hope of heaven. You could spend your finite time making sure that someone gets something to eat. And that's an expression of love. Jesus doesn't want heartbreak and pain and loneliness and dissolved relationships. Jesus wants us to care for one another in the best way we can. Amen.